Ever tasted something without salt? Could you imagine living without it? What would happen if salt suddenly disappeared from your life? Number 5. Salt wars and rebellions. Did you know people literally went to war over salt? Crazy, right? But in medieval times, salt wasn't just that white stuff on your dinner table, it was basically medieval gold. In 1197, the city of Bruges rebelled against taxes on salt. The entire city went into full revolt mode against their own ruler. When the Count of Flanders tried to charge extra for salt, people lost their minds and started a massive uprising. The streets filled with angry merchants and ordinary citizens waving whatever weapons they could find. They weren't just annoyed, they were ready to die over salt prices. Salt was so valuable that cities like Venice built their entire economy around it. The Venetian Republic controlled salt production along the Adriatic coast, and this control helped transform Venice from a small fishing village into one of the wealthiest trading powers in the medieval world. The city's rulers weren't playing around either. Smuggling salt could get you executed. Yes, executed for salt. Even kings got involved in the salt business. The French kings established a salt tax called the gabelle that lasted for nearly 500 years. People hated it so much that it contributed to the French Revolution. Imagine being so angry about a salt tax that you help overthrow your entire government. In medieval Poland, salt mines like those at Wieliczka were considered national treasures. Kings fought over these mines, and workers spent their entire lives underground extracting salt crystals. Some of these miners even carved elaborate chapels out of salt rock hundreds of feet below the surface, complete with salt chandeliers and salt statues. Today, tourists can visit these underground salt cathedrals, the legacy of medieval salt obsession. Number 4. The medieval preservation revolution. Did you ever wonder how people kept food from spoiling before refrigerators? What if I told you salt basically made civilization possible? In medieval times, winter was a terrifying prospect. Without modern refrigeration, communities faced a serious problem: preserve enough food to survive until spring or starve to death. Salt was the answer. A typical medieval household would slaughter animals in late autumn when temperatures dropped. Then came the frantic race against time. Workers would quickly cut meat into portions while others prepared massive amounts of salt. They'd pack pork, beef, and fish into barrels, layering them with salt in a process called salting down. Without this preservation method, most people would simply starve to death during winter. Fishermen along coastal villages developed entire salt-based economies. In places like medieval Norway and Iceland, cod fishing became the economic backbone of entire regions. After catching the fish, workers would gut them, split them open, and pack them with salt before drying them on large wooden racks. This created stockfish, a rock-hard preserved fish that could last for years without spoiling. People would literally beat these dried fish with hammers before cooking them. The preserved fish trade created vast shipping networks across Europe. Barrels of salted herring from the Baltic Sea region fed people hundreds of miles inland. Without this salt preservation, many inland communities simply couldn't have existed. In medieval monasteries, monks developed advanced preservation techniques using salt. They created detailed records of exactly how much salt was needed for different types of food. These monasteries became food preservation experts, teaching local communities how to properly salt everything from cabbage to pork. The famous monastery at St. Gall in Switzerland had entire buildings dedicated just to salt storage. Salt preservation also created entirely new foods. Prosciutto, bacon, and other cured meats we enjoy today were originally medieval preservation techniques. By carefully controlling salt levels and aging, medieval food preservers found that salt didn't just prevent food from rotting, it could transform it into something delicious. A leg of pork properly salted and aged for months would develop complex flavors that fresh meat simply couldn't match. Medieval cheese making relied heavily on salt as well. Without proper salting, cheeses would quickly spoil or develop dangerous bacteria. By carefully salting cheese curds, medieval cheesemakers could create products that would improve with age rather than rot. The harder, aged cheeses we still enjoy today, like Parmesan, were originally designed as preservation foods that could last through winter. Number 3. Salt as medieval medicine. Would you rub salt in your wound? Sounds crazy, right? But medieval doctors actually prescribed it. Medieval medicine looks bizarre to modern eyes, but salt was considered legitimately medicinal. Doctors trained at prestigious medical schools like Salerno in Italy prescribed salt remedies for dozens of conditions. They weren't just making things up either, some salt treatments actually worked. For wounds and infections, medieval doctors created salt poultices. They'd mix salt with herbs and apply the paste directly to injuries. While incredibly painful, imagine salt in an open wound, this treatment had some merit. Salt creates an environment where many harmful bacteria struggle to survive, potentially reducing infection risk. Modern wound care still sometimes uses saline solutions, essentially salt water, to clean injuries. Medieval medical texts like the Trocula recommended salt for women's health issues. One treatment involved creating salt baths for various female complaints. While many medieval medical ideas were based on misunderstandings of how the body works, salt baths could provide some relief for skin irritations and infections. Salt was also critical in treating tooth problems. Without modern dentistry, toothaches could be agonizing and potentially deadly. Medieval dental practitioners would pack painful teeth with salt pastes, sometimes mixed with herbs like sage or mint. The salt could temporarily reduce swelling and kill some bacteria, providing temporary relief. Digestive problems were often treated with salt remedies too. Medieval doctors believed in the theory of humors, that illness resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids. They prescribed specific amounts of salt to restore these balances. For constipation, they might recommend salt water drinks that actually worked as effective laxatives. Medieval Arabic physicians were particularly advanced in their use of salt as medicine. The famous Dr. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, wrote extensive treatises on salt's medicinal properties in his Canon of Medicine. This text was translated into Latin and influenced European medicine for centuries. Ibn Sina recognized different types of salt had different medical properties, recommending specific varieties for specific conditions. The most surprising medical use of salt. Mental health treatment. Medieval doctors prescribed salt baths for what they called melancholy, what we might now recognize as depression. Patients would soak in warm saltwater baths as treatment. While not a cure for mental illness, the relaxing nature of warm baths might have provided some temporary relief from symptoms. Medieval hospitals kept extensive salt supplies not just for food but specifically for medical treatments. The Hospital of St. John in Bruges had salt storage rooms alongside their patient wards. Monastery infirmaries would track their salt usage separately from kitchen supplies, considering medicinal salt a different category of resource. Number 2. Salt money and status. Have you ever been worth your salt? Did you know that phrase comes from actual payment practices? Would you believe people were once literally paid in salt? The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, referring to the salt allowance given to Roman soldiers. While medieval Europe had moved beyond literal salt payments, the substance remained so valuable that it functioned as a form of currency in some regions. In places far from salt sources, a bag of salt could be worth more than the same weight in precious metals. In medieval African kingdoms like Mali and Songhai, salt was traded in standardized blocks across the Sahara Desert. These salt blocks had specific values, with merchants and officials accepting them as payment for goods and services. Trans-Saharan camel caravans would transport salt blocks south from desert salt mines while bringing gold north. Salt was literally valued alongside gold. Even in Europe, salt was sometimes used for official payments. In some Italian city-states, certain taxes could be paid in salt rather than coins. This practice made sense in regions where salt production was controlled by the government. The Republic of Venice accepted salt payments for certain harbor fees from merchants already dealing in the salt trade. Medieval aristocrats demonstrated their wealth through salt. At noble dining tables, elaborate salt cellars, containers for salt, became status symbols. Made from precious metals and sometimes encrusted with jewels, these weren't just containers, they were statements of wealth. The most famous example, the Cellini salt cellar, created later during the Renaissance, was made of solid gold and valued at the price of an entire building. The positioning of salt at the medieval dining table created the expression above the salt or below the salt. Important guests would sit above the salt, between the lord and the salt cellar placed in the middle of the table. Less important guests sat below the salt at the lower end of the table. Your relationship to salt literally determined your social standing at dinner. In medieval households, the person who carried the salt to the table held a position of honor. This wasn't just about bringing seasoning, it was a ceremonial role. The salt bearer would taste the salt first to prove it wasn't poisoned, an important consideration in medieval courts where poisoning was a real threat. This role was often given to a trusted member of the household or even a noble youth being trained in court etiquette. Salt access created social divides between regions. Coastal areas with easy salt production generally had wealthier, healthier populations than inland regions where salt was expensive. This salt divide influenced everything from local cuisine development to military strategies. Armies would specifically target enemy salt supplies, knowing that without it, food preservation and military campaigns would fail. For the medieval peasant, salt was a precious commodity that required careful budgeting. A typical peasant family might spend a significant portion of their income just on the salt needed to preserve food for winter. This created economic stress that lords and tax collectors often ignored when demanding payments. When taxes increased on already expensive salt, it could push struggling families into genuine crisis. Number 1. God, demons, and salty superstitions. Can salt stop the devil? Would you throw salt over your shoulder after spilling it? Why were medieval people so suspicious about salt? Salt wasn't just food or money in medieval times, it was deeply connected to spiritual beliefs. The Bible mentions salt dozens of times, calling believers the salt of the earth and stating, "Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt." Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. These religious references elevated salt from mere seasoning to divine substance. Medieval churches used salt in baptism ceremonies. The priest would place a few grains of salt in the infant's mouth while saying prayers to ward off evil. This practice, called the ceremony of salt, symbolized purification and protection. Parents considered this salt blessing essential for their child's spiritual safety. Church records show that even during salt shortages, baptismal salt was carefully preserved. Salt was believed to repel demons and evil spirits. Medieval households would place small dishes of salt in the corners of rooms, especially nurseries where infants slept. This practice crossed religious boundaries. Both Christians and Jews in medieval Europe used salt as spiritual protection. When someone died, relatives would sometimes pour salt around the body until burial preparations were complete to prevent evil spirits from claiming the soul. The superstition of throwing spilled salt over your shoulder began in medieval times. People believed the devil lurked behind your left shoulder, waiting to cause mischief. Spilled salt supposedly attracted evil, but throwing some over your left shoulder would hit the devil in the face and temporarily blind him. This peculiar belief was taken seriously enough that etiquette guides mentioned proper responses to spilled salt. Medieval miners developed extensive salt superstitions. Before entering salt mines, workers performed specific rituals to appease spirits they believed lived within the salt deposits. In the famous Wieliczka salt mines of Poland, miners carved shrines into salt walls where they would pray before beginning work. They believed certain supernatural beings called salt dwarves could either help or hinder their mining efforts. Salt was considered so pure that witchcraft supposedly couldn't work in its presence. During witch trials, suspicious objects would sometimes be covered in salt to neutralize any dark magic. Some medieval homes kept salt-filled amulets as protection against curses and the evil eye. These traditions weren't limited to uneducated peasants. Court records show educated nobles and clergy also participated in these salt protection rituals. The fear of salt shortage was connected to apocalyptic beliefs. Medieval religious texts sometimes described the end times as a period when salt loses its savor. This biblical reference was taken literally by some communities who viewed any problem with salt production or unusual taste in their salt as a possible sign of impending doom. Medieval sailors had particularly strong salt superstitions. They believed spilling salt on board ship would anger the sea gods and cause storms. Some fishing communities held ceremonies blessing their salt supplies before major fishing expeditions. These sailors would rather go hungry than use salt that hadn't been properly blessed. Could salt predict the future? Many medieval people thought so. Fortune-telling practices often involved throwing salt into flames and interpreting the resulting cracks and pops. Young women seeking to dream of future husbands would place salt under their pillows on specific saints' days. These practices weren't seen as contradicting Christian beliefs, but rather working alongside them in the highly superstitious medieval worldview. What magical powers might be hiding in your salt shaker? How much of our modern relationship with salt still carries echoes of these medieval beliefs? Next time you season your food, will you think about the centuries of history, conflict, and mystery contained in those tiny white crystals?